If you were to ask a dozen military strategists, intelligence officers, or even just people who follow geopolitics, where is World War III most likely to start? The answer you usually get, it isn't the trenches in Eastern Europe or the deserts of the Middle East. It's not even the Korean Peninsula, really, despite all the rhetoric.
Right.
It's a narrow strip of water, roughly 100 miles wide, separating this rising superpower from a small, vibrant, democratic island. I'm talking, of course, about the Taiwan Strait.
It's often described as the most dangerous place on Earth.
Yeah.
And, well, for good reason.
Yeah.
It's the epicenter of a conflict that is, technically a civil war that just never actually ended.
Yeah.
It's a leftover piece of history that has somehow become the absolute linchpin of the entire global economy.
Basically with technology.
Especially with technology. And maybe most terrifyingly, it's the one place where the interests of the United States and the People's Republic of China, they just collide head on.
It feels like we see the headlines every other week, right? China flies jets near Taiwan. United States sends a warship through the strait. Will they invade? Won't they invade? It can get pretty overwhelming and honestly a little repetitive if you don't know the underlying mechanics.
It just becomes background noise.
Exactly. It's this background noise of anxiety, but it doesn't actually explain what is happening. So welcome to the Doctrine Deep Dive. Our mission today is to move past those scary headlines and actually understand the engine that's driving this conflict.
Right. We want to get into the doctrine, the history, and the cold, hard strategic calculus that Beijing, Taipei, and Washington are all using.
We need to move beyond the will they or won't they speculation and really look at the why and the how.
Precisely. And to do that, we have to look at the foundational documents, the leading theories in international relations about East Asia. We need to, strip away the rhetoric and look at the actual machinery of the relationship.
And we have a massive stack of sources for today's deep dive to help us do exactly that.
A big one.
Yeah, we're going to be pulling from Richard Bush's A One China Policy Primer from the Brookings Institution, which is, I have to say, essential for understanding the diplomat speak that usually confuses everyone.
Oh, it's a minefield.
Yeah. We also have Oriana Schuyler Mastro's rather alarming article, The Taiwan Temptation from Foreign Affairs. We're looking at Scott Kastner's research from International Security on whether the Strait is still a flashpoint.
Right.
We have a very controversial proposal from Charles Glazer, also from International Security, about a potential grand bargain. And finally, we're looking at a transcript from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, about the lessons Beijing is learning from the war in Ukraine, plus some lecture materials regarding international relations in East Asia.
It's a really robust list, and it covers the full spectrum from the diplomatic history all the way to the military reality and, grand strategy. It lets us sort of triangulate what's going on.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We've got a roadmap for today. First, we are going to decode the diplomatic language, specifically the difference between the One China policy and the One China principle.
Sounds like semantics, but it's everything.
It really is. Then we're going to look at what's called the Taiwan temptation, why the status quo seems to be crumbling, and why military options are becoming, real. Then we'll touch on the Ukraine factor, what lessons are being learned, and finally we'll ask the big question. Is war inevitable? Or could some kind of grand bargain save the peace?
It is a lot to cover, but it is probably the most important conversation in international security right now.
Okay, so let's start at the very beginning, or at least the beginning of this current crisis. We talk about Taiwan and China as these separate places, but this is really a family feud, isn't it? It's like a divorce that never got finalized.
That's a very apt analogy. To understand the tension today, you really do have to go back to 1949. You had the Chinese Civil War. It was between the communists, led by Mao Zedong, and the nationalists, the Kuomintang, led by Chiang Kai-shek.
Right.
The communists won on the mainland. They established the People's Republic of China in Beijing. The nationalists, they were defeated but not destroyed, and they fled across the strait to the island of Taiwan, and they maintained the Republic of China government there.
So from 1949 onwards, you basically have two governments, and both of them are claiming to be the real China.
Yes.
It wasn't that Taiwan wanted to be independent back then. It was that they wanted to be the boss of the whole thing.
Exactly right. For decades, both sides agreed on one critical thing.
Yeah.
There was only one China. They were just fighting over who was the legitimate ruler of it.
And for a long time, the United States was on Taiwan's side.
Completely. The U.S. recognized the government in Taiwan, the Republic of China, as the legitimate government of all of China. We even had a mutual defense treaty with them signed back in 1954.
Which seems wild in retrospect. I mean, thinking that this small island government represented 1 billion people on the mainland.
It was a product of the Cold War, but, eventually reality had to set in. The People's Republic of China on the mainland wasn't going anywhere. It was a nuclear power. It was a massive market. And critically, it was a strategic counterweight to the Soviet Union.
The enemy of my enemy.
Precisely. So in 1979, the United States made this massive strategic shift. We switched our diplomatic recognition from Taipei to Beijing.
And this is where we get into what I was calling the diplomatic minefield. I was reading that Richard Bush primer, and I have to admit I had to read certain paragraphs 3 times over.
I don't blame you.
There's this term, one China, that gets thrown around constantly. Beijing says it, Washington says it. But Richard Bush points out that they mean completely different things.
This is the most common misconception, and it's a really dangerous one.
Okay, so break it down for us.
So Beijing has its one China principle. It's very clear-cut. It has 3 parts. 1, there's only one China. 2, Taiwan is a part of China. And 3, the People's Republic of China is the sole legal government of that China.
No ambiguity there.
None whatsoever. It is an absolute claim of sovereignty. End of story.
Okay, that's Beijing's principle. But the United States says it has a one China policy. How is that different? I mean, isn't policy and principle just a synonym game?
In diplomacy, words are weapons. And the distinction here is, well, it's massive. The United States' one China policy is a masterpiece of diplomatic ambiguity.
Sure.
When the United States normalized relations with China in 1979, we did, in fact, recognize the People's Republic of China as the sole legal government of China. However, and this is the crucial however, we did not recognize their sovereignty over Taiwan.
How do they manage that?
It's all in the language of the joint communique. The United States merely acknowledged the Chinese position that Taiwan is part of China.
Okay, hold on. You just said the United States acknowledged Beijing's position. That sounds like agreeing with it.
Oh, it is a world of difference. It's everything. In diplomatic speak, to recognize something is a legal binding acceptance. To acknowledge is more like, okay, let's say you and I are arguing over who owns a parking spot.
Okay, I claim it, it's my spot.
Right. You say, that spot is mine. If I recognize your claim, I am legally agreeing that it's yours. I can never park there again. It's settled.
Okay.
But if I acknowledge your claim, I'm essentially saying, I hear you saying that spot is yours. I understand that you think it's yours, but I am not explicitly agreeing that it is in fact yours. I'm just noting your position.
That feels incredibly passive-aggressive.
It is. And that passive aggression is what has prevented World War III for 40 years.
Wow.
Richard Bush's primer really highlights this as the genius of that 1979 communique. By using the word acknowledge, and what's even more interesting is that the Chinese text uses a slightly different word, closer to take note of. The United States managed to establish relations with Beijing without legally signing away Taiwan's future.
It was a linguistic trapdoor.
A linguistic trapdoor that let everyone leave the room feeling like they won. Yes.
So, Richard Bush calls this the forced choice. He explains that during the Cold War, you couldn't have embassies in both Beijing and Taipei. They wouldn't allow it. You had to pick one. So we picked Beijing for strategic reasons, but essentially created this workaround to keep dealing with Taiwan just unofficially.
And that workaround is codified in the Taiwan Relations Act. Congress passed it in 1979, immediately after the switch in recognition.
What does that act do?
It's a piece of U.S. domestic law, and it says the United States will provide Taiwan with arms of a defensive character. And it maintains that the U.S. must have the capacity to resist any use of force against the island.
So we have a policy that officially engages Beijing.
Right.
But simultaneously, through our own law, we protect Taipei.
It is a balancing act that requires constant maintenance. It's a permanent state of tension management.
Speaking of maintenance, or maybe the lack of it, the lecture materials you sent over mention something called the 1992 consensus. This seems to be another one of those diplomatic terms that's holding a lot of weight.
It is. The 1992 consensus is fascinating because it's essentially an agreement to agree to disagree.
How does that work?
Well, representatives from the Communist Party on the mainland and the Kuomintang Party in Taiwan, they met. They both agreed on the statement, there is only one China. But, and here's the catch, they agreed that each side could define what one China meant however they wanted.
So for the communists, one China meant the People's Republic in Beijing.
Right.
And for the nationalists in Taiwan at the time, one China meant the Republic of China, based in Taipei.
Exactly. It was a brilliant delaying tactic. It allowed them to do business, to open up trade and travel without ever having to solve the fundamental sovereignty issue.
But something has changed.
Something has changed. The problem, as we see in the slide data on identity, is that the political landscape in Taiwan has completely shifted.
You mean the current government?
Yes. The current ruling party in Taiwan, the Democratic Progressive Party, or DPP, they never accepted the 1992 consensus.
Why not?
Their argument is that Taiwan is already a sovereign, independent country called the Republic of China, Taiwan. So there is no need to claim to be part of some vaguely defined one China with the mainland.
And that rejection infuriates Beijing.
It absolutely does. From Beijing's perspective, the 1992 consensus is the bedrock of cross-strait relations. If Taipei walks away from that, Beijing feels that the entire foundation for peace is gone.
So the whole diplomatic framework that held the peace for decades is just dissolving.
It's dissolving, and that creates a very, very dangerous situation.
Which brings us perfectly to our next segment. I mean, if the diplomatic fuzziness that kept the peace is evaporating, what happens next? This is where we get into Oriana Schuyler Mastro's article, The Taiwan Temptation. And I have to say, this was probably the most unsettling thing in the stack to read.
It's a very sobering piece.
It wasn't just dry analysis, it felt like a warning siren.
Her central argument is that the era of peaceful reunification is fading if it's not already dead. For decades, the assumption in the West was that China would try to woo Taiwan back with economic engagement.
Win them over.
Or just wait until the disparity in power was so enormous that Taiwan had no choice but to surrender. Mastro argues that Beijing's thinking has shifted fundamentally.
And she points heavily to Xi Jinping. It seems like every conversation about modern China eventually comes back to him. What's his specific role in changing this calculus? Why is he so different from the leaders before him?
Xi Jinping has tied the recovery of Taiwan to his signature concept, the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation.
So it's a legacy project.
It's a legacy project. Previous leaders like, say, Deng Xiaoping or Jiang Zemin, they were willing to kick the can down the road. Their priority was economic growth, stability. Xi has stated quite explicitly that the Taiwan problem cannot be passed down from generation to generation. He wants to be the leader who finally ends the civil war and restores what he sees as China's full sovereign territory. Mastro argues this isn't just rhetoric, it's a requirement for his political legitimacy.
And there was a specific event that Mastro and the lecture slides both point to as a turning point for the Taiwanese public. The event that makes peaceful reunification basically impossible now.
Hong Kong.
Hong Kong.
Yes. The Hong Kong effect cannot be overstated. You have to remember the formula Beijing has always offered. Taiwan is one country, two systems.
Right.
This was actually invented for Taiwan, but it was applied to Hong Kong first when the British handed it over. And the idea was simple. You accept our sovereignty, but you get to keep your way of life, your courts, your freedoms, your capitalist system.
It was the sales pitch.
It was the sales pitch. But then came the crackdowns in Hong Kong, especially with the national security law in 2020. We all saw the protests on TV. We saw the arrests of journalists, politicians.
We saw democracy dismantled in real time.
Exactly. And when Beijing dismantled Hong Kong's civil liberties, they effectively killed the credibility of one country, two systems in the eyes of every single person in Taiwan.
So the dream is dead.
The dream is dead. Mastro points out that this forced Beijing to realize something critical. They are never going to win Taiwan over voluntarily. The carrot is gone. Only the stick remains.
And that stick is getting very, very big. Mastro details what she calls the 4 campaigns. And I want to dig into these because usually when people talk about a war over Taiwan, they just imagine D-Day, a massive beach invasion.
Right.
But she outlines a much more complex menu of options that Beijing has.
It's much more nuanced. The 4th campaign she lists is the full-scale invasion, the amphibious landing. That's the hardest, bloodiest, riskiest option by far.
Last resort.
The last resort. But she outlines 3 others that could come first, or in combination with each other. First up is the joint firepower strike.
This would be the missile attacks we always hear about.
Precisely. China has a massive, and I mean massive, arsenal of ballistic and cruise missiles. They could use them to hammer Taiwan's military infrastructure radar sites, airfields, naval bases, government buildings in Taipei.
What's the goal there? Just destruction.
The goal is to disarm the island, to achieve shock and awe, to destroy Taiwan's ability to fight back and force a political capitulation without ever having to put a single soldier on the beach.
Okay, so that's option 1. Then she lists the blockade. And this one, to me, this one is maybe the most frightening because it feels so plausible.
It's a very, very likely scenario. Taiwan is an island. It imports almost all of its energy oil, natural gas, and a huge amount of its food.
It's incredibly vulnerable.
Extremely. China could use its navy, which is now the largest in the world, and its cyber capabilities to simply cut the island off from the world. No ships in, no ships out. They could mine the harbors, cut the undersea internet cables, and just wait.
Squeeze them into submission.
It would strangle the economy and try to break the will of the population. I mean, can you imagine living in a modern, bustling city like Taipei with no power, no internet, and dwindling food supplies, all while missiles are potentially flying overhead?
It's a medieval siege with modern weapons.
It's exactly what it is.
It's like-
And it creates a terrible dilemma for the United States. Do you try to break the blockade? That's an act of war.
Okay, and the third campaign she mentions is anti-accessoria denial, or A2AD. This sounds technical.
It sounds technical, but the concept is brutally simple. It's the strategy of preventing the United States military from intervening in the first place.
How would they do that?
It involves their long-range missiles, specifically the ones they've nicknamed carrier killers. These are missiles that can hit a U.S. aircraft carrier from over 1,000 miles away. It also means striking U.S. bases in the region, like the ones in Guam or in Japan.
So it's a direct attack on U.S. forces.
It is. The message to Washington is simple. If you try to help Taiwan, you will bleed. Your ships will sink. Your bases will burn. Stay out.
Wow. So those are the first three options. But Mastro still calls the actual amphibious landing the fourth campaign. Isn't that just D-Day? We've all seen the movies, boats hit the beach, soldiers run out. Why does she frame it as being so incredibly difficult?
It is D-Day, but it's on a difficulty setting that didn't exist in 1944. Mastro and the experts in that CSIS transcript, they all point out the geography here. Taiwan is a defender's dream.
How so?
It has very few beaches that are actually suitable for a massive landing, maybe 14 in total. And the terrain right behind those beaches is a nightmare for an attacker. It's urban sprawl and steep, rugged mountains.
So the Chinese army knows exactly where they have to go.
And the Taiwanese army knows exactly where they're coming from.
It's a kill box.
It's a massive kill box.
Right.
And you have to remember, to even get to that beach, China's army has to cross 100 miles of rough water. That is an agonizingly long time to be a sitting duck in a transport ship while anti-ship missiles, drones, and submarines are actively hunting you.
A failed invasion would be catastrophic for Beijing.
Mastro argues that Beijing knows this. They know a failed invasion could potentially topple the Communist Party itself. The political risk is immense, and that's why she emphasizes the other campaigns, the missile strikes, the blockade. They want to break Taiwan's will without ever having to risk that swim.
The key point in her article seems to be this idea of capabilities versus intent. She argues that for a long time, the West sort of comforted itself by thinking China wouldn't attack because they couldn't. They didn't have the military ability to pull it off.
Right.
But her argument is that now they're increasingly confident that they can.
That is the temptation in her title. Mastro argues that Chinese leaders are moving from a strategy of deterring independence, which is basically just stopping Taiwan from formally declaring itself a new country, to a strategy of compelling unification.
What's the difference?
Deterring independence is defensive. It's about maintaining the status quo. Compelling unification is offensive. It's about changing the status quo by force. They are building a military that is designed to win, even if the United States intervenes. And if they believe they can win, the temptation to act becomes much, much stronger.
But why now? Or why soon? This connects to the research by Scott Kastner on whether the strait is a flashpoint.
Yeah.
He talks about something called the closing window theory.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds a little contradictory to me. China is getting stronger militarily, so shouldn't time be on their side? Shouldn't they just wait?
You would think so. And in terms of raw power, GDP, number of ships, number of missiles, time absolutely favors Beijing. The gap gets bigger every year.
So what window is closing?
Kastner and the data from the lecture slides, they point to a different trend where time is working against Beijing. And that trend is identity.
I was looking at those charts in the slides. The shift is just incredible. In 1992, a huge chunk of the population on the island, something like 45%, identified as both Taiwanese and Chinese. It was this hybrid identity.
Right.
Today, that number has completely collapsed. It's in the single digits. The vast majority now identify as Taiwanese only.
This is the absolute nightmare scenario for the Chinese Communist Party. They are losing the hearts and minds of the people. A distinct Taiwanese national identity has formed, and it's hardening.
It's a generational shift.
It is. Young people in Taipei, they don't look at the mainland and see their motherland. They see a foreign authoritarian neighbor. They might share language, more or less, but they do not share a political destiny.
So the closing window is psychological, it's cultural.
Exactly. Kastner explains the danger here through the lens of a preventative war.
What does that mean?
It means if Beijing concludes that peaceful unification is now impossible because the Taiwanese people have culturally drifted away permanently, then they might feel they have to act militarily before that separation becomes totally irreversible in the eyes of the world. They might feel they have to conquer the island physically because they have already lost it psychologically.
So the stronger Taiwan's democracy and identity get, the more threatened Beijing feels.
That's the tragic paradox. It creates a race between China's military modernization, which is opening the window for a war, and Taiwan's identity consolidation, which is closing the window for a peaceful outcome.
That is a terrifying dynamic.
Right.
It suggests that even if Taiwan does everything right, just exists as a peaceful, happy democracy, that very existence becomes a provocation to Beijing.
It creates a situation where the status quo, which every country claims they want to preserve, is actually inherently unstable. It's being eroded from both sides, just in different ways.
Now, we can't talk about a large authoritarian neighbor planning to invade a smaller democracy without talking about Ukraine. The CSIS transcript we have, Ukraine and Taiwan, parallels and early lessons learned, is fascinating. It's got experts like Bonnie Lin and John Culver. And the big question everyone is asking is Xi Jinping looking at Russia's disaster in Ukraine and thinking, you know what, maybe I shouldn't do this?
It is the million-dollar question, isn't it? The CSIS experts argue that China is definitely learning, but they might not be learning the lesson we in the West want them to learn.
Meaning?
They aren't necessarily looking at Putin's failures and thinking, invasion is too hard, let's give up. They're looking at Putin's failures and thinking, how do we do it better? They're creating a checklist of what not to do.
Okay, so what's on that checklist?
Yeah.
One of the things mentioned was sanctions. The West unified incredibly fast and hit Russia with massive economic sanctions.
Right. And Bonnie Lim points out that China is studying this with intense focus. They are trying to sanction-proof their economy.
How do you even do that in a globalized world?
It's what they call their dual circulation strategy. The idea is to make China's domestic economy more self-reliant and less dependent on foreign technology, while at the same time making the rest of the world more dependent on Chinese manufacturing and markets.
So they want to be indispensable.
They want to ensure that if the West tries to sanction them like they did Russia, the economic pain would blow back on the West just as hard, if not harder. They're building an economic fortress. They're stockpiling grain. They're stockpiling energy. They're buying up gold.
Wow. Okay, so that's the economic lesson. What about the military lessons? The nuclear threat was another one. John Culver from the panel made a really chilling point.
I remember this.
He said that Russia's nuclear threats, even if they were just bluffs, were effective. They kept the United States and NATO from putting boots on the ground in Ukraine.
Yes, the nuclear shadow. China has observed that at the end of the day, the United States is deterred by a large and capable nuclear arsenal.
So what's the lesson for them?
Build more nukes, and that's exactly what we're seeing. Satellite photos show China is rapidly expanding its own nuclear capabilities. They're building hundreds of new missile silos out in the desert.
To what end?
The logic is, if we have a massive, credible nuclear deterrent, the United States might hesitate to intervene over Taiwan, just as it hesitated to intervene directly in Ukraine. They want to checkmate the American president before the game even starts.
So they're learning how to keep us out? What about the actual fighting on the ground? We've all seen these incredible videos of how effective the Ukrainians have been with smaller, mobile weapons against big Russian tanks and ships. Is Taiwan learning that lesson?
That is the porcupine strategy, a term Mike Green used in that CSIS transcript. The idea is that Taiwan shouldn't even try to match China ship for ship or plane for plane.
It's a losing game.
It's a losing game. China has too many ships, too many planes. Instead, Taiwan needs what they call asymmetric capabilities.
Meaning things that are cheap but effective, like sea mines, portable anti-ship missiles, armed drones, things that make the island indigestible.
Exactly. A porcupine doesn't hunt the lion. It just makes itself very, very painful to eat. The goal is to inflict so much pain on an invading force that the cost becomes too high for Beijing to bear.
But is Taiwan actually doing that?
That's the problem. The experts on the panel noted that Taiwan's military establishment has historically preferred the big, shiny, expensive toys. the F-16 fighter jets, the big naval frigates.
Stuff that looks good in parades.
The stuff that looks good in parades and is great for morale, but is also incredibly vulnerable to Chinese missile strikes in the first hour of a war. Ukraine has shown the world that a smaller, determined force, armed with the right asymmetric weapons and the will to fight, can hold off a much larger aggressor. The question is whether Taiwan can pivot its defense strategy fast enough.
And whether they have that will to fight. The CSIS panel also discussed the importance of information warfare. I mean, Russia clearly thought they would be welcomed as liberators in parts of Ukraine.
And they were disastrously wrong.
Right. So China needs to know, will the Taiwanese people actually fight for their island?
And China is prioritizing information control to make sure the answer is no. They want to dominate the narrative. They'll try to cut off Taiwan's internet, flood their social media with disinformation, and break their morale before the shooting even starts.
They saw how Zelensky used social media.
They watched President Zelensky rally the entire world from a bunker with his phone, and you can be sure they are making plans to ensure a Taiwanese leader can never do the same. They want a quick, decisive victory that presents the world with what's called a fait accompli, a done deal, before the West can even begin to mobilize a response.
Okay, so we've talked about the military threat, the diplomatic mess, the lessons from Ukraine, but there's usually one thing that's supposed to stop major wars between major powers. Money, economics. We often hear about this idea, the Silicon Shield, the idea that Taiwan is just too economically important for the world and for China to destroy.
This is the optimistic view, and Scott Kastner's research touches on this. And it's true, Taiwan and China are deeply, deeply economically entangled.
Like Foxconn.
Foxconn is a perfect example. A Taiwanese company that assembles Apple's iPhones, employing huge numbers of people on the mainland. And of course, the giant in the room is the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC.
They make all the chips.
They make the vast majority of the world's most advanced microchips, the ones that power everything.
So if you're listening to this on a smartphone or on a laptop,
there is a tiny sliver of silicon inside it that almost certainly came from one factory in Taiwan. The argument goes that if China attacks, they blow up the supply chain for their own tech companies, for their own military, for everything. It seems like economic suicide.
So the shield should hold, right?
It does seem irrational from a purely economic standpoint.
Right.
But here's the counter-argument, and Oriana Schuyler-Mastro makes this point very clearly in her article. Sovereignty usually trumps economics for the Chinese Communist Party.
You mean they care more about the flag and the map than they do about the GDP numbers?
History suggests they do. When national legitimacy and territory are at stake, authoritarian regimes have often shown they are willing to accept massive economic pain to achieve their goals. We just saw it with Putin in Ukraine. He knew sanctions were coming, and he invaded anyway.
So we can't just assume that the Silicon Shield is impenetrable.
I think that's a dangerous assumption. In fact, some strategists worry that Taiwan's dominance in chips actually makes it more of a target.
Yeah.
The idea that China might want to seize that capacity for itself, or at the very least deny it to the West in a conflict, the shield could actually be a magnet.
So if economics won't save us, and traditional military deterrence is getting harder and harder, is there another way out of this? This brings us to the most controversial paper in our stack today, Charles Glazer's A U.S.-China Grand Bargain.
This is a proposal that makes a lot of people in Washington, and especially in Taipei, very, very uncomfortable.
I can imagine.
Glazer looks at the current trajectory, this rising danger of a catastrophic, possibly nuclear war between the United States and China over Taiwan. And he asks a very hard, very blunt question.
Which is
Taiwan worth it?
Wow. That is a harsh question. It sounds heartless.
It is the cold, brutal logic of the realist school of thought in international relations. Glazer proposes what he calls a grand bargain.
Okay, what's the deal?
The United States would end its security commitment to defend Taiwan. We would essentially announce that the Taiwan Relations Act no longer applies. We would walk away.
We would just abandon them?
We would. In exchange, China would have to agree to resolve all its other maritime disputes peacefully, like its claims in the South China Sea, and it would have to officially accept the United States' long-term military presence in the rest of Asia in places like Japan and South Korea.
Wait, I need to pause you there, because what you're describing, it sounds incredibly cold. Charles Glazer is basically suggesting we trade 24 million people in a democracy like a baseball card. I'll give you Taiwan, you give me peace in the South China Sea.
It is cold. That's the hallmark of this kind of realist theory. Glazer isn't looking at morality, he's looking at geopolitical math.
What's the math?
His argument is that the probability of a nuclear war over Taiwan is rising every year, and the cost of that war is, well, it's infinite. It's the end of the world as we know it. Therefore, the most logical move is to remove the single biggest flashpoint, regardless of the moral cost.
But that's terrifying. I mean, if you're living in Taipei and you hear a serious academic proposing this, you have to be thinking, does the United States view me as expendable?
And that is exactly why this proposal is so controversial and so heavily debated. But we have to try to understand it from Glaser's perspective. He argues that China's rise is inevitable. And if the U.S. tries to cling to every single point of influence in what China sees as its backyard, we just trigger a security dilemma.
Where our defense looks like aggression to them.
Precisely. He thinks we need to strategically shrink our defensive perimeter in Asia in order to save the overall peace. To sacrifice a piece on the chessboard to avoid flipping the whole board over.
But what about credibility? I mean, it's the word you always hear. If we dump Taiwan, why would Japan ever trust our security guarantee? Why would South Korea trust us? Wouldn't the entire U.S. alliance system in Asia just collapse?
That is the #1 counter-argument, and it's a powerful one. If the United States abandons a democratic partner because the going gets tough, our security guarantees could become worthless overnight.
What would happen then?
Well, Japan might decide it needs its own nuclear weapons to defend itself. South Korea might cut a side deal with China. It could create a cascade of instability across the entire region rather than stabilizing it.
And there's also the question of whether China would even honor their side of the bargain.
Exactly. This is the salami slicing problem. It sounds a lot like appeasement to many people, and we all know how well that worked out in Europe in 1938.
Right. You give them Taiwan. Do they actually stop? Or do they just say, great, now we want the Senkaku Islands from Japan?
Appeasement has a very poor track record in history. Now, Glaser would argue that a formal public grand bargain would lock in limits in a way that informal appeasement doesn't. But skeptics would say China would just pocket the concession and ask for more later.
It seems like a desperate proposal. But the fact that serious scholars are even writing about it in a top journal like International Security, it really shows you just how dangerous the situation has become. People are desperately looking for off-ramps from this collision course.
They are, because the alternative, the path we are currently on, looks increasingly like a train wreck in slow motion. We are, quite simply, running out of good options.
So after all of this, where does this leave us? We've gone through the whole stack of sources. We have a U.S. one China policy that relies on this delicate, ambiguous dance.
A dance where everyone has to keep their story straight, yes.
Well, the reality on the ground, the identity of the people is changing completely. And then you have the one China principle from Beijing, which is clear, absolute, and becoming more and more impatient.
And caught in the middle, you have a Taiwanese population that is moving further and further away, culturally and politically, from any desire for unification. The fundamental goals are just diverging.
Taipei wants to be Taiwanese. Beijing needs them to be Chinese.
And Washington wants everyone to just calm down and keep the peace so the global economy doesn't implode.
But the military balance is shifting. That temptation for China to use force is growing. And the lessons they seem to be learning from Ukraine suggest that if they do decide to go, they might try to go big and go fast to keep the U.S. out of it entirely.
It creates a very, very precarious balance. For decades, we've relied on this policy of strategic ambiguity, keeping China guessing about whether we'd actually intervene and keeping Taiwan guessing a little so they don't do something rash like declare formal independence.
But as the stakes get higher, ambiguity might not be enough. It might just be confusing.
The margin for error is shrinking to zero.
It really feels like we are watching a clock tick down. For decades, the entire strategy from everyone was just to kick the can down the road. The hope was that, I don't know, maybe China would eventually become democratic or Taiwan would change its mind or something would happen.
Right, let the next generation solve it.
But Xi Jinping is basically standing up and saying, I am done kicking the can. The road ends here.
That is the crux of it. If the peaceful road to unification is now closed by Taiwanese identity, and the military road is being opened wider every day by the People's Liberation Army's modernization, we are entering the danger zone.
Okay, here's a final thought for you, for our listeners to mull over. We talk a lot about United States policy. Should we be ambiguous? Should we be clear and promise to defend Taiwan? But maybe the biggest variable here isn't in Washington or in Beijing. Maybe it's in Taipei. If the Taiwanese people demonstrate a clear and overwhelming will to fight for their own freedom like the Ukrainians did, that changes the entire calculus for everyone. But if they aren't, then all the American aircraft carriers in the world might not be enough to save them.
That's a profound point. Ultimately, the future of Taiwan will be decided by the people of Taiwan and how much they are willing to sacrifice for that distinct identity they have so painstakingly built over the last 30 years. The entire deterrence equation depends as much on the will of the Taiwanese people as it does on American military might.
This has been the Doctrine Deep Dive into the Taiwan Strait. It's a heavy topic, for sure, but an absolutely essential one. We hope we've helped you see some of the machinery behind the headlines.
It is incredibly complex, but understanding it is the first step to navigating it.
Thanks for listening. Stay curious and keep reading.